Please state your name, who you represent, and your position on the bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Jack Gullahorn. I am an attorney here in Austin, and I am here today representing myself, probably unwisely, and I am in opposition to this legislation. And I should start off by saying that that pains me because I have a lot of respect for Representative Capriglione and what he is doing and has done on a lot of other legislation. But this was important enough to me after my first legislative session. I worked up at the Capitol was in 1973, if that gives you any indication of how long I've been around, unfortunately. Because I've spent really the last 15 years of my life encouraging people to register as lobbyists when they needed to register as lobbyists, and because of the fact that I believe that registering as a lobbyist isn't the same as putting a scarlet L on your forehead, I felt like I felt strongly enough to ask you to consider perhaps the negative public policy implications of this. This bill, to me, is counterintuitive to the principles of disclosure and transparency that we want with regard to people that communicate with their government. And I think, perhaps unintentionally but realistically, it continues the negative dialogue and the negative impression about who lobbyists are and what we do. House Bill 503 says that a person is not qualified to run for any public office in the state, and there's certain population categories here, but in general, you're not qualified to run for any public office in the state of Texas for a political subdivision if you are required to be registered as a lobbyist. And there's some interesting play on some of these words, and I want to get way too technical for what I should. The other personal qualifications, just so you'll know, about disqualifications for running for the legislature are, other than age and residency, which applies to everyone, or if you're a felon or if you're mentally incapacitated. So now we're going to have three: felon, mentally incapacitated, and lobbyist. Now, I won't go into the bad jokes about a lobbyist in at least one or more of those categories, but really, lobbyists, people that are mentally incapacitated, and felons would be excluded from being able to run for any public office in Texas. So why is this a big deal to me, and why do I think that this is perhaps a bad idea? First, I would assume that an argument for this that Representative Capriglione put forward is it creates a conflict of interest with your elected position. And then secondly, I assume that the person being lobbied is not going to know what hat that person is wearing, may not be aware of that. I would argue, of course, that if you're having to register as a lobbyist and say who it is that you work for and what you're doing, that it probably gives you a better idea of what kind of hat that person is wearing. It's important to understand, at least from my perspective, that Texas has a very strong lobby law with regard to registration. It doesn't just impact those of us that come up at the state level and lobby the legislature. It impacts anybody that communicates with any state employee if what they're trying to do, and they're getting compensated in some way, shape, or form for that, is to communicate to influence their decision. So it's not just an outcome of a legislative matter, it's an outcome of any administrative matter, and the way the law is defined, and that's basically anything. So I think it is also, as a fine point to this, to understand that one of the thresholds that require you to register, not that you necessarily register, but that you're required to register, is if you're paid at least $1,000 in a calendar quarter and spend at least 40 hours of your compensated time in that calendar quarter communicating or preparing to communicate. So if I work for a company in Fort Worth or wherever I may be, and part of my job is dealing with a state agency, I may spend a lot of time preparing for my meeting with that state agency person to try to convince them of some position that my company has. That requires me to register if I've crossed that threshold. This bill would say that I no longer would be able to run for the Tarrant County Junior College or board. I would not be able to run for other lower political subdivision or the city council, whatever it might be, because I'm required to register as a lobbyist. So I think that the one of the points I think that's important here is to recognize that we have worked hard to convince people that they need to register if they get close to that line. I mean, there are a lot of us that have worked very hard trying to raise the level of ethical responsibility and adherence to the laws. I do believe that this bill, which a person that would be eligible to run for office because of $1 or 1 hour differential in what they determined was that threshold, would either not be allowed to run for office or would be allowed to run for office. They'd be required to register. So the distinction between a person required to register in many instances is fairly minute, and it's fairly technical. This, by the way, is not one of those provisions that made it all the way to the conference committee last session. The House took this out. It wasn't an agreed provision, as I've heard, at least in the Senate, that all these provisions that you're hearing are. So this one was not something that the House passed last session, just to let you know. In short, this really creates a policy choice for you, and I would encourage you to consider not moving forward with this legislation. And again, I don't like coming up and testifying against somebody's bill when they put a lot of effort into it, and I think all of you know that. But this legislation will disqualify a particular category of honest, competent people who are trying to do the right thing for running for office in any political subdivision in the state that meets those population limits. And I respectfully suggest that it's something that should not move forward. Thank you. I'll be glad to try to answer your questions.
Thank you, Jack. Members, do you have any questions? I'm listening to your testimony. I was wondering, do you think that a side effect would be that there would be fewer people registering as lobbyists that should be registering?
Absolutely. I get a lot of pushback in my immediate former job as head of the Lobby Association when I try to get people to register and explain to corporations and associations, you need to register all those people. They say, well, it's going to cost me $750 a person to do it. Why would I do it? I said, because it's the law. You need to do that. Now, the interesting thing is that this bill says a person that's required to register, so people that choose not to register, that have crossed that threshold, they're not eligible either. And I'm not sure what happens when somebody files that kind of a suit against them if they were required to, hopefully there's another way that this particular problem of conflict with people that are elected officials and trying to wear two hats and maybe not let people know that could be addressed. I just don't think that this way is the best way, and I would suggest that it really would be counterproductive to transparency and disclosure.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much.